I should have listened to Bailey. That thought haunted me as I stood at the edge of the woods, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. The sunlight filtering through the trees felt colder than it should have, and the once familiar forest now seemed like something out of a nightmare. I dialed 911, my voice barely steady as I spoke. But maybe I should start from the beginning. Bailey has always been a good dog. Not just a good dog, the best dog. I got him as a puppy 5 years ago, a golden retriever with big paws and an even bigger heart. He grew up right beside me, through every high and low. We had our routine, morning walks around the neighborhood, weekend hikes, lazy afternoons in the backyard, where he chased butterflies while I read on the porch. He never gave me trouble, never refused a walk, never showed fear. That's why I knew something was wrong when he refused to go into the woods. We lived in a quiet town in Vermont, a place where everyone knew everyone. My house backed up to a stretch of forest, acres of tall trees and winding trails. I walked through them almost daily, ever since I was a kid. My parents used to take me camping there, pointing out the different trees, teaching me how to listen for the sound of a deer in the brush. It was home. Familiar. Safe. Or at least, it used to be. The first time it happened, I had just clipped on Bailey's leash and started toward the woods like I always did. But as soon as we reached the tree line, he stopped. Not in an excited way, not in a distracted way. He planted his feet, his tail lowered, ears pinned back. His body was tense, his eyes locked on something deep in the trees. But when I followed his gaze, there was nothing. Just the same towering maples and oaks, the same path I'd walked countless times. I gave the leash a gentle tug. "Come on, boy." Bailey didn't move. I tried again, a little firmer, but he let out a low, uneasy whine. He backed up a step, then another, almost as if trying to pull me away from the trail. I crouched beside him, running a hand over his fur, which was bristled along his back. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. "What's wrong?" I murmured, glancing around. The woods were quiet, eerily so. No birdsong, no rustling leaves from squirrels or rabbits. Just silence. I sighed and gave him a reassuring pat. "Fine, we'll go another way." He relaxed instantly, turning eagerly toward the road instead. That should have been my first sign that something was off, but I brushed it aside, assuming maybe there was a deer he smelled or a noise I couldn't hear. Dogs had their instincts, after all. I didn't think much of it, until the next day, when he did it again. And the day after that. Every time we approached the woods, he refused to go in. The whining got worse, his body language more desperate. He would stare into the trees like something was watching us, like something was waiting. And every time, the woods were silent. I told my neighbor about it one evening while we chatted over the fence. Mr. Clark had lived here longer than anyone, knew everything about this place. If something was going on, he would know. "Bailey's been acting weird about the woods," I said. "He won't go in." Mr. Clark frowned. "That's strange. Right? He's never been scared of anything before, but now it's like he thinks there's something dangerous in there." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You hear about that missing hiker?" I blinked. "What?" He nodded toward the trees. "A guy from out of town. Was camping up that way about a week ago. Never came back." A chill ran down my spine. "They find anything?" "Not that I heard. Just vanished." He shook his head. "It's strange, but you know how the woods can be. People get lost. Happens more often than you'd think." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way Bailey acted, the way the woods felt different. The missing hiker, it had to be a coincidence, it had to be, but something gnawed at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. And then, 3 nights later, Bailey woke me up. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I felt him nudge me, his cold nose pressing against my hand. I groaned, blinking in the darkness. "Bailey, what?" Then I heard it. A sound from the woods. Not the usual rustling of branches, not the distant hoot of an owl. It was different. A low, rhythmic sound. Almost like a whistle. Not a bird's call, not wind. Something else. Bailey let out a quiet whimper, pressing against me. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, faint, but deliberate. I hesitated for only a second before slipping out of bed, grabbing my flashlight and heading downstairs. Bailey stuck to my side, his body tense. I opened the back door cautiously, the cool night air rushing in. The woods were dark, shadows stretched across the ground, shifting with the movement of the trees. I clicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the edge of the forest. Nothing. Then the whistle came again. Bailey growled, his body low to the ground. He was afraid. And Bailey never growled. I swallowed hard. Every instinct told me to turn around, to lock the door, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But another part of me, a deeper, stubborn part, needed to know, needed to see. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped toward the tree line. Bailey whined, his tail tucked. He pawed at my leg, as if begging me to stop. I hesitated, shining my flashlight deeper into the woods. The beam landed on something up ahead. Something out of place. A backpack. A chill spread through me as I recognized it from the news report. The missing hiker. Bailey barked sharply, a sound of warning, of urgency. My breath caught in my throat. Then, from the darkness, something moved. I turned and ran. Bailey bolted beside me, his leash still in my grip, dragging me forward. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as we sprinted back toward the house. I slammed the door shut behind us, locking it, my chest heaving. I grabbed my phone and dialed. 911, what's your emergency? I sucked in a breath, still shaking. There's something in the woods. The operator's voice barely registered over the sound of my pulse hammering in my ears. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Bailey stood by my side, his body pressed against my leg, his breath quick and shallow. He wasn't growling anymore, but his ears were pinned back, and his tail was tucked so tightly it almost disappeared beneath him. "What's your emergency?" the operator asked again. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. I found a backpack. In the woods. I think it belongs to the missing hiker." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you safe?" I turned my head, staring at the window that faced the woods. The darkness beyond the glass felt suffocating, heavy, as if something, or someone, was just beyond the tree line, waiting. "I think so," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. "But there was something out there. Can you describe what you saw?" I hesitated. How could I? The way the trees shifted in the darkness, the backpack lying there as if it had been placed deliberately, the way Bailey had reacted. It all felt wrong. But how do you explain a feeling? "I don't know," I admitted. "Something moved. I didn't stay to find out what." There was a rustling noise from the other end, like papers being shuffled. "We're dispatching an officer to your location. Please stay inside and keep your doors locked. If you see or hear anything else, call back immediately." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Okay." Bailey let out a low whine, his nose pressed against my knee. I hung up the phone and knelt beside him, running my hands through his fur. He was trembling. That wasn't like him. "It's okay, buddy," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "Help is coming." I stayed by the window, watching, waiting. The minutes stretched on endlessly, my ears straining for any sound beyond the house. The woods remained eerily still. No wind, no night birds, nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Bailey didn't leave my side. Every few seconds, he glanced up at me, his eyes dark and filled with something that looked almost like worry. Then finally, headlights appeared in the distance. A patrol car pulled into my driveway, and I practically bolted to the front door. I hesitated for only a moment before unlocking it and stepping outside. The officer, a tall man with short cropped hair, climbed out of the car. His name tag read Garrison. "You the one who called?" he asked, his gaze flicking to Bailey, who stayed right next to me. I nodded. "Yeah, it's in the woods, just past the tree line." He studied me for a moment, then pulled out a flashlight and motioned for me to lead the way. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed not to go back out there, but I couldn't just stand there while he went in alone. We crossed the yard, Bailey still glued to my side. As soon as we reached the edge of the woods, he stopped again, planting his feet firmly on the ground. I glanced down at him. "Not coming?" His ears flattened, and he let out a soft huff. That was answer enough. Garrison swept his flashlight beam across the ground. "Where exactly?" I pointed. "A little deeper in, maybe 20 yards. He nodded and started forward. I took a breath and forced my legs to move. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the leaves and branches ahead of us. Everything looked the same as before, but now, standing in the silence, I felt it again. That overwhelming sensation that we weren't alone. "There," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The backpack was still there, right where I'd seen it. It looked weathered, the fabric dirty and slightly torn, but it didn't appear to have been out here for too long. Garrison crouched beside it, shining his light over the straps and zippers. "Definitely looks like something a hiker would carry," he murmured. He pulled a pair of gloves from his belt and carefully unzipped the main compartment. I held my breath as he rummaged through it. After a moment, he pulled out a wallet. He flipped it open, his expression darkening. "Luke Harris." "The missing guy?" I asked. Garrison nodded, slipping the wallet into a small evidence bag. "Yeah." A cold sensation crept down my spine. It wasn't just that the backpack was here. It was how it was here. How had it ended up in the middle of the woods, so close to my house? And why hadn't anyone found it before? "Stay here," Garrison instructed, standing up. "I'm going to take a quick look around." I wasn't sure if that was a good idea, but I didn't argue. I stayed near the backpack while he moved deeper into the woods, his flashlight bobbing with each step. Bailey had been right. Something was wrong here. I could feel it as clearly as the damp earth beneath my feet. The night air was thick, pressing in around me. Then I heard it again. The whistle. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. My breath hitched in my throat. I turned my head slowly, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the trees distorted the sound, bouncing it around until I couldn't tell which direction it was coming from. "Garrison?" I called out, my voice just loud enough to carry. No response. I turned back toward the house. Bailey was still at the edge of the trees, his body tense, his eyes locked on something just beyond my sight. His ears were perked, his tail stiff. He wasn't barking, he wasn't growling, he was just watching. I swallowed hard. "Garrison?" Then his flashlight went out. The darkness swallowed everything, and the air around me seemed to drop in temperature. My stomach twisted into knots. A twig snapped. Not far away. I reached into my pocket, my fingers fumbling for my phone. My pulse was hammering so hard I could barely think straight. My hands were so cold I almost dropped it, but I managed to unlock the screen and tap the recent call list. Bailey barked. Loud. Urgent. I turned just in time to see something. Someone. Move between the trees. I hit the call button. 911, what's your emergency? I didn't have time to explain. Send someone now, I said, my voice shaking. Something's out here. Bailey barked again, but this time, it wasn't just a bark. It was a warning. And then, from the darkness, the whistle came again, closer this time. The whistle came again, cutting through the silence like a knife. My breath hitched, and Bailey growled low in his throat, his stance shifting to one of pure defense. His body was rigid, his fur bristling, and he didn't take his eyes off the trees. My grip tightened on my phone as I took a shaky step back. The dispatcher's voice crackled in my ear. Sir, are you still there? I swallowed hard. Something's out here. Can you describe what you're seeing? My gaze darted between the dark silhouettes of the trees. My own flashlight beam bounced wildly across the undergrowth, but I didn't see anyone. Just shifting shadows, an unsettling sense of movement just beyond my line of sight. There's something in the woods, I whispered. Officer Garrison went to check the area, and then his flashlight went out. I heard a noise, a whistle. A pause, then, stay where you are, and do not engage. Backup is on the way. Bailey let out a sharp bark, his body lunging forward as if warning whatever was out there to stay back. My pulse was so loud in my ears I barely heard the dispatcher say something else before the call cut out. I glanced down at my phone. No signal. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to get back to the house. But I couldn't just leave Garrison out here. Bailey moved beside me, his body low to the ground, as I hesitated between retreating and stepping forward. The woods were still unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no night sounds. And then the crunch of footsteps. Not mine, not Bailey's. I turned, flashlight trembling in my grip as I scanned the trees. The light flickered over something just ahead, a dark shape crouched low against the forest floor. My breath caught in my throat. It was a person. They were still, unmoving, their face obscured by the shadows. Garrison? I asked, though deep down I knew it wasn't him. The figure didn't respond. They didn't even flinch. Bailey barked again, louder this time, his tail stiff, his body straining forward like he wanted to charge. I took a step back. My fingers tightened around my flashlight as I adjusted the beam, trying to get a clearer view. The figure remained frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, they moved. Not toward me. Up. They stood in one slow, fluid motion, and something about the way they did it made my stomach twist. Too smooth. Too unnatural. My heart pounded as the person took a step forward. Who are you? My voice came out more panicked than I intended. No response. Just silence. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and uneven. Bailey was rigid beside me, every muscle in his body ready to lunge. My instincts screamed to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure turned and walked away, deeper into the trees. Not ran. Walked. Calm. Unhurried. Like they knew I wouldn't follow. I should have been relieved, but instead I felt even worse. Bailey whimpered at my side, pawing at my leg as if urging me to leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I took one last glance toward the darkened path, then turned and sprinted toward the house. Bailey kept pace with me, his breath coming in quick huffs. The moment we broke through the tree line, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The house was just ahead, the porch light casting a warm glow against the darkness. I stumbled up the steps, fumbling with the lock before shoving the door open and slamming it shut behind me. Bailey paced restlessly by the door, letting out occasional low whines as if he was still on high alert. I braced myself against the wall, forcing in deep, steady breaths. I reached for my phone, but the signal was still gone. I stared at the screen, dread curling in my gut. I needed to know if Garrison was okay, but I wasn't going back out there. Not alone. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see movement in the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the endless trees and the heavy weight of silence. And then, finally, flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. I rushed to the door as another patrol car pulled up, 2 officers stepping out. One was a woman with short, dark hair, her face set in a serious expression. The other was an older man with a firm jaw and sharp eyes. They both looked tense. "Are you the one who called this in?" the woman asked. I nodded, opening the door. Bailey stuck close to my side, his tail still stiff. "Where's Officer Garrison?" the man asked. I swallowed hard. "He went into the woods to check out the backpack. He never came back." The 2 officers exchanged a look. The woman pulled her radio from her belt and spoke into it. "Dispatch, we've got a missing officer, requesting immediate search assistance." I rubbed my arms, trying to chase away the lingering chill. "There was someone else out there," I said. "I saw them." The male officer turned to me. "What did they look like?" I hesitated. "I don't know, it was dark, but they were just standing there, watching." And then, they walked away, just walked. No rush, nothing. The woman lowered her radio, her eyes sharp. "Which way?" I pointed toward the woods. "They went deeper in." She turned to her partner. "We need to move." They didn't hesitate. The 2 of them headed straight for the woods, flashlights cutting through the darkness. I watched from the porch, my stomach twisting. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I saw them stop just inside the trees. The man bent down, shining his light at something on the ground. My throat went dry. Garrison's flashlight. The male officer picked it up, clicking the button a few times. Nothing. It was completely dead. He exchanged a few words with his partner, then lifted his radio. "Dispatch, we have a visual on the officer's last known location. No sign of him yet. Continuing search." Bailey whined beside me. I absently reached down and ran my fingers through his fur. I wanted to believe everything was going to be okay, that Garrison would turn up, that this was all just some misunderstanding, some awful coincidence. But then the whistle came again, and this time it was closer than before. The whistle came again, clearer now, sharp against the stillness of the night. My breath caught in my throat as Bailey stiffened at my side, a low growl rolling from deep in his chest. The 2 officers in the woods froze, their flashlights scanning the darkness around them. I gripped the porch railing, my knuckles turning white. And then, from somewhere beyond the trees, a voice called out, "Help!" It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. My heart pounded. "That's Garrison!" the male officer shouted. The woman turned back toward the house, her eyes locking onto mine. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear, do not come out." I barely had time to nod before they took off, moving quickly but cautiously, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they disappeared into the thick of the trees. The moment they were gone, the silence returned, swallowing everything whole. I glanced down at Bailey. His ears twitched, his body pressed so tightly against my leg I could feel his quick, shallow breaths. I ran a hand down his back, trying to calm him, but my own hands were trembling. The seconds stretched into minutes. The occasional crackle of a radio filtered through the night, but it was too far for me to make out the words. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, voices, anything. But all I got was the wind shifting through the trees. And then a different sound. Footsteps, not from the woods, from the side of the house. Bailey's growl deepened, his muscles coiling as he turned toward the noise. My pulse spiked as I grabbed my phone, but my fingers fumbled with the screen. The signal was still dead. I stepped back, forcing myself to breathe. The motion sensor light on the side of the house hadn't turned on. Whoever, or whatever, was moving. They were staying in the shadows. I glanced at the front door. It was locked. Every window was shut. But that didn't stop the feeling that something was pressing in. Waiting. Bailey let out a sharp bark. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, everything was still. The only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then the whistle came again. But this time, it wasn't from the woods. It was right outside my house. I barely had time to react before the doorknob rattled. Bailey lunged at the door, barking so fiercely I could feel the vibrations through the floor. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Was it the officers? No. They were too far in the woods. Someone else was here. The rattling stopped, replaced by a long, unnerving silence. Bailey continued to bark, his nails scratching against the hardwood. I forced myself to move, to grab the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy flashlight sitting on the table by the door. The house felt like a trap. No matter which direction I looked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, the sound of footsteps retreating. Bailey's barking slowed, but he didn't relax. His body stayed rigid, his ears perked, his head turning as he listened. I took a breath, my chest tight. I needed to see who it was. Slowly, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, I stepped toward the window. Bailey followed, his tail low, his body brushing against my leg. I reached the window and peered through the blinds, my heart hammering. At first, I saw nothing. Just the yard, the edge of the trees, the faint glow of the patrol car's lights reflecting off the grass. Then, movement. A figure stood at the far edge of the yard, just before the woods. Too far to make out their face. Too still. My fingers clenched around the blinds, my breath hitching. They weren't moving. They were watching. Bailey let out a low, warning growl. I stepped back from the window, my stomach churning. And then, as if they had been waiting for me to see them, they turned and walked into the woods. No rush, no hesitation. Just like the one I had seen earlier. The whistle came again, drifting through the trees. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I nearly dropped it. The screen flickered. Service was back. A flood of missed calls and messages popped up, but I ignored them and immediately dialed 911. It rang once, twice. Then, 911, what's your emergency? This is the same caller from earlier, I said quickly. I saw someone outside my house. They were watching me. They walked into the woods. The dispatcher's tone sharpened. Stay inside. Lock everything. Officers are already in the area. A crackling sound came through the line, like interference. Then, a muffled voice. It was Garrison. Help! Trees! Static swallowed the rest. My stomach lurched. Was that Officer Garrison? The dispatcher hesitated. Sir, stay inside. We're sending... The call cut out. Bailey whined. I looked back at the woods. The figure was gone. But something about the trees felt wrong, like the darkness had grown thicker. I paced the room, my fingers gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Every instinct told me to stay put, to wait for the officers to return. But that sound, Garrison's voice, was stuck in my head. He was alive, somewhere, and he needed help. I looked at Bailey. "You're not going to like this." His ears flicked, his expression cautious. I grabbed my jacket, shoved my phone into my pocket, and picked up the flashlight. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward the door, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it. The air outside was cool, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Bailey hesitated, then followed. We stepped off the porch, and the moment my feet hit the ground, the motion sensor light behind me flickered out. The house went dark. Bailey's growl deepened. The woods loomed ahead, silent. And then from somewhere inside them, the whistle came again. Closer this time. Bailey pressed himself against my leg, his body trembling, but not from fear. He was ready. His instincts, sharper than mine, told him something was waiting just ahead. My breath hitched as I took a slow step forward, the weight of the flashlight reassuring in my grip. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of moss, and something else. Something metallic, like old pennies. The woods stretched before us, darker than I had ever seen them, the usual glow from the moon smothered by thick, unrelenting clouds. Each step I took felt like stepping into a place I didn't belong. Bailey's ears flicked back and forth, catching sounds I couldn't hear, his muscles tense beneath his golden fur. I tightened my grip on the leash, unsure if I was holding him back for his safety or my own. Somewhere ahead, the whistle came again, closer. I swallowed hard and forced my feet to move. We pushed deeper into the trees, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick branches overhead. The leaves rustled with a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, carrying with it a faint murmur, almost like voices whispering just beyond my reach. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned in a slow circle, scanning the darkness. Bailey stopped suddenly, his tail rigid, his whole body locked in place. I followed his gaze, my breath catching when I saw it. The backpack. It was lying in the dirt, half open, the contents scattered as if someone had gone through it in a hurry. My stomach twisted. I knew what it was before I even stepped closer. Luke Harris's backpack. I bent down slowly, Bailey sticking close, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the air. I reached out, my fingers hesitating just before I touched the worn fabric. Then something cracked in the underbrush behind me. I whirled around, flashlight beam darting between the trees. Nothing. But I wasn't imagining it. Bailey's growl confirmed that. The whistle came again. This time, it was right behind me. I spun, my heart slamming against my ribs. The flashlight flickered, and for a fraction of a second, I saw movement. A shape. Someone was standing between the trees. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The figure was barely visible, their body blending too well with the darkness, like the shadows themselves were wrapping around them. Then, slowly, too slowly, they tilted their head. A chill ran down my spine. Bailey barked, loud and sharp, the sound breaking the eerie silence. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. "Who's there?" I finally managed to say, my voice tight. No answer. Bailey took a step forward, his tail raised in stiff warning. I tightened my grip on his leash, my mouth suddenly dry. I wanted to back away, to turn and run, but something told me not to. The figure raised an arm. I barely had time to react before my flashlight flickered again, the light dimming just enough for the shadows to swallow them whole. And then they were gone. Vanished. Bailey lunged forward, barking wildly, pulling at the leash, but I held him back. My breath came fast and shallow as I forced myself to scan the trees, to listen for footsteps, for breathing, anything. But there was nothing. Just the whisper of wind and the distant echo of that haunting whistle. I needed to get out of here. Bailey was already tugging me back toward the house, and this time I let him. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but as I lifted it to check the screen, my stomach dropped. No signal. Again. I clenched my jaw and shoved it into my pocket. The house wasn't far. If I could just make it back, lock the doors, wait for the officers. A branch snapped ahead of me. I stopped dead in my tracks. The woods were supposed to be empty. I had just been standing there, and there was no one. But now, something was ahead of me. And I wasn't alone. Bailey let out a deep, guttural growl, his fur bristling. I swung the flashlight forward, but the beam barely reached through the thick shadows. My fingers tightened around the handle. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence was worse. My skin crawled. I turned sharply, checking behind me, half expecting the figure to be standing there again. But there was nothing. A voice cut through the silence. "Help me." My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a whistle. It was a person. And it sounded like Officer Garrison. I took a step forward, then hesitated. My mind screamed at me to think. It didn't make sense. The officers had gone deeper into the woods, farther than I had. There was no way Garrison had made it back to this spot before me. Unless... Bailey whined beside me, his whole body tense. He didn't want to go forward. I turned my head slightly. "Garrison?" Silence. Then the voice again. "Help me." Same words, same exact tone. Like a recording. My blood turned ice cold. Bailey barked furiously, snapping me out of my frozen state. I didn't wait to analyze it any further. My feet moved before my mind did, dragging Bailey with me as I turned and bolted toward the house. Branches whipped past me, scratching my arms, catching my jacket, but I didn't slow down. The trees blurred together, the path to my backyard burning itself into my vision as I ran. The house came into view, the porch light still dark, the front door a beacon of safety. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my muscles screaming. Bailey barked again, and I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Something was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. I reached the porch in a sprint, nearly stumbling as I yanked the door open and shoved myself inside. Bailey followed, and I slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking fingers. I pressed my back against the wood, my breath ragged. My ears rang, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I turned, peering through the peephole, barely able to focus through the adrenaline surging through me. The yard was empty. The woods were still. Bailey paced restlessly beside me, his body tense, his eyes still locked on the door. Then, just as I was about to step away, I heard it. Not from the woods, not from outside, from inside the house. The whistle. The whistle came from inside the house. Every nerve in my body froze as my breath caught in my throat. Bailey went rigid beside me, his ears flicking toward the sound. My grip on the flashlight tightened until my knuckles ached. My mind scrambled to make sense of it, but there was no explanation that didn't send a fresh wave of terror through me. I had locked every door. Every window was shut. I wasn't alone. Bailey's low growl rumbled beside me, his fur bristling. His body was tense, ready to lunge. I swallowed hard and forced my feet to move, my breath shallow as I turned toward the hallway. The darkness felt thicker inside the house than it had outside. The shadows stretched in ways that didn't make sense. I stepped forward, barely breathing. Another whistle. This time it was further inside. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I knew I had to move carefully. My pulse pounded in my ears as I crept toward the kitchen. The only sound was the soft padding of Bailey's paws against the floor, staying close, his presence the only thing grounding me. I reached the doorway and slowly peeked around the corner. Nothing. The kitchen was empty, just as I had left it. The back door was locked, the windows untouched. My fingers trembled as I swept the flashlight across the room. My own reflection in the dark window startled me for a moment, but there was no movement, no figure waiting in the shadows. And then the floor creaked. Not behind me, upstairs. I sucked in a sharp breath. My stomach twisted. There was no one else in this house. There shouldn't have been. Bailey let out a soft whimper, his tail tucked. He didn't like this. Neither did I. I forced my feet to move, stepping back into the hallway. My hand tightened around the flashlight as I lifted my gaze toward the stairs. The house was so quiet now that I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat. Another creak, a slow, deliberate sound. Bailey growled again, low and deep, his body pressing against my leg. I knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to charge. But I didn't know what was up there. I didn't know if I wanted to find out. I took a breath, gripping the banister as I slowly placed my foot on the first step. It barely made a sound. I moved carefully, each step deliberate, controlled. The higher I went, the heavier the air felt. The flashlight beam bounced against the walls, stretching shadows that seemed to pulse with every movement. Another step. Another whistle. It was close now. Too close. I reached the top of the stairs and paused. The hallway stretched before me, lined with doors leading to different rooms. My bedroom, the guest room, the small office I barely used. All of them were closed, just as I had left them. Bailey was right beside me, ears perked, body tense. I hesitated, my fingers slick with sweat, as I reached for the nearest doorknob. My bedroom door. I turned it slowly, the faintest click echoing in the silence. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. My bed was undisturbed, the blanket still folded where I had left it that morning. The window was locked. There was nothing in here. I exhaled, but it wasn't relief. Something was wrong. And then I saw it. The closet door. It was open. Just an inch. I knew for a fact I had closed it. I always did. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I stepped forward, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Bailey's growl deepened, his body lowering as he prepared to lunge. I reached for the closet door. And then, something inside moved. A breath. Barely audible, but undeniable. Bailey barked, and I yanked the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty. My clothes hung neatly in their place, my shoes lined against the back wall. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. No gaps. No shadows big enough to conceal anything. But I had heard it. I knew I had. Bailey stepped forward, sniffing the air. His ears twitched, but he didn't growl again. He didn't bark. But he was still uneasy. I swallowed hard and stepped back, my heart still racing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe the stress, the fear, had made me hear things that weren't there. But I didn't believe that. I backed out of the room and shut the door, gripping the handle for a second longer than necessary before turning away. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house. I took one step back toward the stairs. And then the whistle came again. But this time, it wasn't from inside the house. It was outside. Bailey barked sharply, turning toward the window. My stomach clenched as I moved quickly to the nearest one, peering outside. The yard was empty. The trees stood silent. The wind barely stirred the leaves. But I could feel it. Something was watching. Bailey whined beside me, pressing close, his body rigid. I clenched my jaw and grabbed my phone. The signal was back. I immediately dialed 911. It rang once, twice, then a voice answered. But it wasn't the dispatcher. It was my own voice. "Help me." The same words I had heard in the woods, the same tone, the same cadence. My own voice, repeated back to me. I dropped the phone. Bailey barked again, this time frantic, and I knew we couldn't stay here. I turned on my heel, grabbing my car keys from the table as I bolted for the front door. My breath came fast and uneven, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I threw the door open and stepped outside, but the moment my foot hit the porch, I froze. Someone was standing at the edge of the yard, still, silent, watching. The same figure from before. They didn't move. They didn't react. But I knew they saw me. The whistle came again, so close now it felt like it was inside my own head. And then, in the distance, another sound. Sirens. The patrol cars were coming. Bailey barked again, and for the first time since stepping into those woods, I felt a flicker of hope. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, but something in the air shifted, like the weight of whatever was watching had lessened. The sirens grew louder. And then, without a sound, the figure turned and walked into the woods. No rush, no hesitation, just like before. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, until the first patrol car pulled into the driveway, the flashing lights flooding the yard with red and blue. An officer stepped out, but I barely registered his face. All I could hear was the echo of that whistle, still ringing in my ears. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the yard, but even with the arrival of the officers, the uneasy weight in my chest didn't lift. Bailey stood at my side, his body tense, his ears flicking between the woods and the officers approaching. He wasn't barking anymore, but he wasn't relaxed either. That wasn't a good sign. A tall officer with sharp eyes and a square jaw approached first, his flashlight scanning the yard before settling on me. "You the one who called this in?" His voice was steady, professional, but his gaze flicked toward the trees as if he already knew something was off. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah." Another officer, shorter and stockier, stepped up beside him. "What exactly happened?" I licked my lips, struggling to find the right words. "Someone was here, watching. There was a whistle. I've been hearing it all night." Both officers exchanged a look. The taller one, his name tag read Carter, turned back to me. "Did you see them clearly?" I hesitated. Not clearly, but they were there, at the edge of the yard. I pointed toward the spot where the figure had stood just moments before. And then they just walked into the woods, like they weren't in a hurry, like they knew they wouldn't get caught. Officer Carter turned to his partner. "Take a look around." The stocky officer nodded, already reaching for his radio as he walked toward the tree line, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. I forced myself to take slow breaths, but it didn't help much. Even with the law here, I still felt exposed. Carter studied me for a moment. "Tell me everything from the beginning." I started talking, trying my best to keep my voice steady. I told him about Bailey's strange behavior, about the missing hiker's backpack, about Officer Garrison disappearing, about the whistling. I even mentioned the strange voice on the phone, the one that had mimicked mine. Carter's expression didn't change much as I spoke, but he didn't look skeptical either. He just listened, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he exhaled through his nose and rubbed the back of his neck. "I won't lie to you," he said. "This isn't the first strange report we've gotten from this area." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, his radio crackled. "Carter, you're gonna want to see this." Carter lifted the radio to his mouth. "What is it?" A brief pause. Then, "Just get over here." Carter glanced at me, then at Bailey. "Stay here." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say there was no way I was staying put after everything that had happened, but the weight in his voice told me I wouldn't like what they had found. Bailey whined as Carter moved toward the woods, his flashlight bobbing. I stayed frozen on the porch, gripping the railing so tightly my fingers ached. The night air pressed heavy around me, thick with tension. Minutes stretched. Then voices, urgent voices. Carter returned first, his jaw tight. He didn't say anything at first, just motioned for me to come closer. I hesitated before stepping off the porch, Bailey glued to my side. As I approached, I caught sight of what the officers had found. Footprints. Deep, deliberate, leading from my yard into the trees. But that wasn't the worst part. The footprints didn't start at the edge of the woods. They started right outside my house. I stared at them, my skin crawling. That's not possible. I would have heard someone that close. Carter's expression was grim. "You sure about that?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. The whistle, the rattling doorknob, the footsteps outside when the lights were out. My mind reeled. Whoever this was, they had been standing at my house, maybe even listening at my door, before they moved back toward the trees. Bailey's growl rumbled low beside me. I forced myself to swallow the rising panic. "What do we do now?" Carter exchanged a glance with his partner, then turned back to me. "We're going to follow the trail, but I need you to stay inside. Keep your doors locked. If anything happens, call us." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As the officers followed the trail into the woods, I hurried back into the house, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I double-checked every lock, every window. Bailey stuck close, his presence the only thing keeping me grounded. I paced the living room, listening for anything. The officers' voices grew faint outside, swallowed by the trees. Minutes dragged, then an hour. Bailey let out a soft huff and lay down at my feet. Though his ears stayed perked, he was waiting too. Then a noise. My phone buzzed on the table. I snatched it up, my breath hitching. Unknown number. My fingers hovered over the screen. I didn't want to answer. Every instinct told me not to. But something deeper, something I couldn't name, forced me to press the button. I lifted it to my ear. "Hello?" For a moment, silence. Then a breath. Not mine, not Bailey's. And then my own voice echoed back at me. "Help me." I yanked the phone away, my chest tightening. The call ended abruptly. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, my breath coming fast and unsteady. Bailey stood up again, his body tense. He had heard it too. I dialed 911, my fingers slick with sweat. It rang. Once. Twice. Then Carter's voice came through. "Stay inside." My stomach twisted. "Did you find something?" A pause. "Just stay inside." The line went dead. I clenched my jaw, setting the phone down with shaky fingers. I had never felt this trapped, this helpless. Something was out there. Something was playing with me. Bailey let out a low whine, his nose twitching as he stared toward the front door. And then, the whistle came again. But this time, it was right outside the window. Bailey let out a sharp bark, his body pressing against me as we both turned toward the window. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except the single thought running through my mind. Someone was out there, watching. The whistle had been close. Too close. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my breath coming fast and shallow. The porch light barely reached beyond the front steps, leaving most of the yard swallowed in darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Bailey growled again, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready to lunge. My fingers tightened around his collar instinctively, unsure if I was holding him back or trying to ground myself. I forced myself to move toward the window, my stomach twisting into knots. Every step felt wrong, like I was being lured into something I couldn't escape. I reached the blinds and took a deep breath before peeking through. Nothing. The yard was still, untouched. No movement, no footprints, no sign of anyone. But I knew better. I stepped back, gripping the phone in my free hand. My thumb hovered over the call button, ready to dial Carter again. Then, from the back of the house, another sound. Not a whistle this time. A knock. Bailey spun around so fast he nearly knocked over the side table. His nails scraped against the hardwood as he bolted toward the back door, barking furiously. I turned just in time to see the motion sensor light flicker on through the glass pane. Someone was at the back door. The knock came again. Slow. Deliberate. I swallowed hard. "Who's there?" No answer. My heart pounded against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, to wait for the officers. But I couldn't just stand there, waiting for whatever this was to come to me. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a fireplace poker from the stand near the kitchen. The weight of it in my hand was cold, solid, a reminder that I wasn't completely defenseless. Bailey didn't stop barking, his body pressed against the door. I stepped closer, every muscle in my body tensed. The light outside flickered for a second, casting strange shadows across the yard. And then I saw it. A figure, just beyond the glow of the light. Standing perfectly still. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any features, but the shape of a person was unmistakable. They weren't moving. They were just standing there. Watching, a chill crawled up my spine. I took a step back. Gripping the poker tighter, the figure raised a hand, knocked once, twice, then stopped. I sucked in a shaky breath. "Who are you?" No response. Bailey's barking turned to a deep, warning growl. He didn't like this. Neither did I. I swallowed hard and slowly reached for my phone again. My fingers felt numb as I dialed Carter's number. It rang once, twice. Then finally, his voice came through. "Carter!" My voice came out hoarse. "Someone's at my back door." A pause. "Stay inside." "I'm inside," I said quickly. "But they're just standing there. They won't answer me." Another pause. Then, "Lock everything. We're coming back now." I let out a shaky breath. "How long?" "5 minutes. Don't engage." The line went dead. I tightened my grip on the poker and took another slow step back. The figure hadn't moved. They were still standing there, their face just out of reach of the light. The shadows clung to them unnaturally, making it impossible to see any details. Then, slowly, they tilted their head. My stomach twisted. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed Bailey by the collar and backed away from the door, my breath uneven. I moved toward the hallway, my back against the wall, my eyes never leaving the glass pane. The figure didn't follow. They didn't press against the glass or try the handle. They just stood there. Then, without warning, the motion sensor light flickered off. The backyard plunged into darkness. Bailey's growl deepened. My fingers trembled against the poker's handle. And then, in the silence, the whistle came again, But this time, it came from inside the house. My chest seized. I spun around, my pulse roaring in my ears. Bailey barked, his head whipping toward the hallway. The whistle came again, this time longer, drawn out. It was coming from upstairs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. How? The footsteps outside, the knocking at the door. They had been trying to distract me, but something else had already gotten inside. Bailey's barking turned frantic. He paced beside me, his tail stiff, his body language screaming that something was wrong. I forced my legs to move. My hands trembled as I raised the flashlight, pointing it toward the stairs. The beam flickered slightly, shaking from the adrenaline coursing through me. The whistle came again. Then a soft creak, like a door opening. My throat tightened. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the house and into the safety of the patrol cars that were on their way. But another part of me, some foolish, terrified part, knew that if I ran now, whatever was inside would always be inside. I had to see. Slowly, I moved toward the stairs, Bailey right beside me. Each step groaned under my weight, the house suddenly too quiet, too still. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before me. My bedroom door was shut. The guest room was too. But the door at the end, the small office I never used, was open. I swallowed hard. My flashlight beam wavered as I aimed it inside. The room was empty, completely untouched, but the window was open. Bailey let out a low growl, his ears pinned back. I moved forward, my legs like lead, and peered out the window. The backyard stretched below, still shrouded in darkness. The motion light had come back on, illuminating an empty yard. The figure was gone. I stepped back, my breath shaky. The whistle had come from here. Someone had been in this room. I turned sharply, scanning the shadows, my pulse racing. Then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, my nerves on edge. I fumbled to pull it out, my fingers slick with sweat. The screen read, "Unknown number." I hesitated. Then, slowly, I answered. I lifted it to my ear, my heart pounding. Silence. Then, in the same voice as before, my own voice. "Help me." A sharp knock sounded at the front door downstairs. I spun, barely able to breathe. Bailey barked, his body tense. The sirens had stopped. The officers were here. I stumbled down the stairs, my legs weak. My fingers fumbled with the locks before I yanked the door open. Officer Carter stood there, his flashlight raised. Behind him, 2 more officers scanned the yard. His eyes locked onto mine. "Are you okay?" I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I turned, looking back inside the house. The hallway stretched before me. Silent. Empty. The whistle was gone. Carter followed my gaze, his jaw tightening. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, the whistle came again. The whistle drifted through the trees, distant yet unmistakable. It sent a fresh wave of unease through me, my stomach knotting as I turned back to Carter. He must have heard it too because his jaw clenched, and he immediately lifted his radio. "All units, we heard it. Stay alert. Keep scanning the perimeter." The 2 officers behind him moved toward the edge of the yard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. My grip on the doorframe tightened, and Bailey stayed pressed against my leg, his body vibrating with tension. I didn't realize how tight my chest was until I forced myself to take a breath. Carter lowered his radio and turned back to me. "Tell me exactly what happened." I exhaled, trying to steady my thoughts. Someone was at my back door. They knocked, but didn't say anything. I saw them standing just outside the light, watching. Then the whistle came again. But this time, it was inside the house. His eyes darkened. Inside? I nodded. It came from upstairs. I checked, but whoever, or whatever, was here was already gone by the time I got there. The office window was open. Carter turned to the officers near the tree line. Check the perimeter and the back entrance. I stepped aside as he moved into the house, his flashlight sweeping across the floor. Bailey stayed close, his tail stiff, his ears pinned back. I followed Carter through the hallway, every nerve in my body still on edge. The house felt different now, like I had let something in that shouldn't have been here. Carter moved toward the stairs, pausing only to glance at me. You said the whistle came from up there? I swallowed hard. Yeah. Without hesitation, he started up the steps, his heavy boots making the wood creak beneath him. I stayed at the bottom, listening as he reached the hallway and moved toward the office. I heard him push the door open, his flashlight beam flickering through the crack. A few seconds later, his voice called down. Window's unlocked. Looks like it was forced. My stomach turned. So someone was in here. Yeah. He stepped back into the hallway, his voice grim. But they're gone now. That didn't bring me any comfort. A sharp crackle came through Carter's radio. We've got tracks leading from the back of the house into the woods. Carter clicked his radio. How fresh? Fresh enough. We should move now if we want to catch whoever it is. He turned toward me, his expression unreadable. You stay here. Keep the doors locked. If anything happens, call me immediately. I nodded stiffly. You're going after them. We have to. Whoever this is, they're not just messing around anymore. I wasn't sure if they ever were. Carter moved past me, heading for the door where the other officers were waiting. My heart pounded as I watched them disappear into the night, their flashlights bobbing as they followed the tracks into the woods. The house felt impossibly empty without them. Bailey let out a quiet whine and nudged my leg. I knelt beside him, rubbing his fur. I don't like it either, buddy. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I sat in the living room, my foot tapping anxiously against the floor. Bailey stayed close, never once lying down fully, his eyes constantly shifting toward the door. The house was too quiet, every small sound making my skin crawl. Then my phone buzzed. I flinched before scrambling to grab it. The screen lit up with a message from Carter. Still tracking. Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around the phone. Then another message came through. We found something. My throat tightened. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I hesitated before typing. What did you find? A long pause. Then, finally, his response. A jacket. It belongs to Officer Garrison. The air in the room grew heavier. My stomach twisted painfully. Where? I texted back. Another long pause. Too far. Shouldn't be this far. I read the words twice, my skin prickling. What do you mean? Another pause, this time longer. Then, finally, he couldn't have walked here. A shiver ran down my spine. Bailey let out a soft, uncertain whine. I lowered the phone, my fingers ice cold against the screen. Another text came through. Stay inside. I locked the phone and set it down on the coffee table, my mind racing. If Garrison hadn't walked there, then what did that mean? Someone had taken him? Dragged him there? Or worse? A sharp noise outside made me jolt. Bailey sprang to his feet, his ears perked. I turned toward the window, heart pounding. The motion sensor light flickered on. And then, a shadow moved, right at the edge of the yard. My breath hitched. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I unlocked the screen. I tapped Carter's name and hit call. It rang. And rang. No answer. The shadow moved again. Closer. Bailey barked, his body pressing against my leg. The ringing stopped. Carter's voicemail clicked on. I hung up and tried again. Still no answer. The figure took another step, just inside the glow of the porch light. I could see them now. Not their face. Just the jacket they were wearing. A police jacket. My stomach dropped. Garrison. My voice cracked. The figure didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there. Bailey barked louder, his body tense. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering. Say something! Nothing. The wind shifted. The porch light flickered slightly. Then, so slowly it made my skin crawl, the figure tilted its head. And then, it whistled. A perfect mimic of the sound that had been haunting me all night. Bailey lunged at the door, barking furiously. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I hit redial. Still nothing. I turned back toward the window, but the figure was gone. Bailey barked again, but this time it wasn't aimed at the yard. It was aimed at the hallway, behind me. A floorboard creaked. I barely had time to turn before the whistle came again. Inside the house, Bailey lunged forward, barking furiously, his body rigid with tension. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The hallway stretched before me, empty. But the sound had been real. It had come from inside the house. My pulse pounded in my ears. My fingers tightened around the phone, but I didn't try calling Carter again. He wasn't answering. Either he was too deep in the woods or something else was stopping him from picking up. Either way, I was on my own. The floor creaked again. Not from outside, not from the front porch, from upstairs. Bailey let out another deep growl, his fur bristling. My heart slammed against my ribs as I forced my legs to move. I took a slow step forward, flashlight beam shaking as I aimed it toward the staircase. The house was suffocatingly silent now, save for the occasional drip of the faucet in the kitchen and Bailey's breathing beside me. Another step, then the whistle again. This time it was clearer, closer. I stopped cold, my throat dry. It came from my bedroom. I had just been in there. The door had been locked. The window had been closed. Hadn't it? Bailey moved ahead of me, his nails clicking against the floor. He wasn't barking now, but his body was tense, his ears twitching. He smelled something. He sensed something. I reached the base of the stairs and swallowed hard before stepping onto the first step. It creaked under my weight. Another step. Then another. The second-floor hallway came into view, stretching before me, lined with closed doors, except one. My bedroom door was open. Just an inch. Bailey's growl turned into a sharp whine. He didn't want to go up there. And suddenly, neither did I. I stood frozen, staring at the gap in the door. My breathing was too loud, too uneven. My fingers flexed around the flashlight, my palms damp with sweat. If I turned and ran, would it follow? If I called out, would it answer? I had to know. I had to see. I forced myself to move. Bailey hesitated for a split second before following. Each step felt like it stretched time, the hallway growing impossibly long. When I reached the door, I stopped. The crack in the doorway was just wide enough that I could see a sliver of the inside. Darkness. The window should have let in some moonlight, but it was like something was swallowing it whole. I raised the flashlight and nudged the door open with the tip of my shoe. The beam swept across the room. My bed untouched. My dresser. My closet. The open window. Open? The window I had locked. Bailey let out a sharp bark, his body pressing against my leg. I turned the flashlight toward the closet. The door was shut, but the feeling in my gut told me it hadn't been a second ago. I took a slow step inside, my breath shallow. My reflection in the dresser mirror looked distorted in the dim light, my own wide eyes staring back at me. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I stepped closer to the closet. The whistle came again. Right behind the door. I choked on a breath, my feet nearly stumbling backward. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, my skin crawling. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct in me screamed to get out. But if I left, if I turned my back, I knew I would never feel safe in my own home again. I had to see. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open. Empty. No one. No thing. Just my hanging clothes, a few boxes on the floor. The stale scent of fabric and dust filled my nostrils. My breath shuddered out of me, my body still tense. I waved the flashlight around, waiting for something to shift, waiting for something to move. Nothing. I exhaled sharply, rubbing my forehead. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the fear, the exhaustion, was making me hear things. Bailey whined, nudging my leg. I turned to him, ready to reassure him. And then I saw it. A footprint, right beside my bed. My stomach twisted as I slowly raised the flashlight. More footprints, faint but there, leading from the closet to the window. Whoever, or whatever, had been inside my house had been standing right next to my bed, watching. My hands trembled as I backed away. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get out. I needed Carter. I turned, ready to rush downstairs. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I nearly dropped it in my panic. My fingers fumbled to pull it out. The screen flashed. Unknown number. Not Carter. I hesitated. Then, with shaking hands, I answered, "Hello?" Silence. Then, a whisper. My own voice. "Help me." I nearly threw the phone across the room. My breath hitched, my chest tightening. "Who is this?" No answer. Just breathing. Then, the line cut off. Bailey barked sharply, his head whipping toward the open window. I spun, my pulse roaring in my ears. A shadow moved outside. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Bailey's collar and sprinted down the stairs, nearly tripping as I reached the front door. My hands fumbled with the locks, my vision blurring with panic. I threw the door open and stumbled outside, dragging Bailey with me. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and unforgiving. The yard was empty, the trees stretching like dark fingers against the sky. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. Watching. Bailey barked again, but it didn't move, didn't run, didn't flinch. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling to dial Carter again. It rang once, twice. A voice picked up, but it wasn't Carter. It was mine. "Help me." The same whisper, the same cadence, my own voice repeated back at me. I dropped the phone. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned toward the figure. My legs wanted to run, but I was frozen, stuck in place, and then, slowly, it lifted an arm and pointed. Not at me, at my house. The air grew thick, suffocating. I turned my head, my throat closing. The front door, the one I had left wide open, was now shut, and from inside, through the thin crack beneath the door. The whistle came again. Bailey's bark cut through the silence, sharp and frantic. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the closed door. It had been open. I knew it had. But now it stood there, locked, sealed like nothing had ever happened. The figure beyond the trees didn't move. It only pointed, its stance eerily still, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. I reached down, gripping Bailey's collar, as much for my comfort as his. My breath came fast and uneven, my chest tightening with every second that passed. I needed to think. I needed to act. But my body felt locked in place, unable to do anything but process the impossible. Then, the whistle came again. This time, it was right behind the door. I staggered back, dragging Bailey with me. The whistle had always been distant, teasing, just beyond my reach. But now, it was here, right inside my house. My hands fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely swipe across the screen. Carter. I needed to reach Carter. I hit dial, my breath shallow as I lifted the phone to my ear. The call connected. Static crackled on the other end. Then, a breath. Not Carter's. Mine. "Help me," my own voice whispered through the receiver. I hurled the phone to the ground. Bailey's growl deepened, his body tense, ready to spring. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might collapse from the weight of it. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But every instinct told me otherwise. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, shifting the shadows. The figure at the edge of the woods lowered its arm. Slowly, it turned and walked into the darkness, swallowed whole by the trees. And then, the front door creaked open. Bailey snarled, lunging forward. I stumbled, barely keeping hold of his collar as he strained against me. The door didn't swing wide. It only cracked open an inch, just enough to let the darkness seep out. The air turned heavy. Cold. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then the door opened further. Bailey barked furiously, his muscles bunching beneath my grip. My entire body screamed for me to run, to turn and flee, but something held me there. Something beyond fear. Something deeper thing. A shadow moved just beyond the threshold. I didn't wait. I grabbed Bailey and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted toward the driveway, my vision blurring with panic. The patrol cars were gone. Carter and his team were deep in the woods, chasing something that wasn't here anymore. Or maybe it never had been. I threw myself toward my truck, yanking the door open with shaking hands. Bailey jumped in beside me, his barks unrelenting. My fingers fumbled with the keys. I shoved them into the ignition, turning it so hard I thought I might snap it in half. The engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into reverse, my tires spinning against the gravel. The house loomed in front of me, the open door like a gaping wound. My headlights spilled across the porch, illuminating the entrance. Empty. No one there. But I knew better. The whistle came again, so soft it barely touched the air. I didn't wait to hear it a second time. I stomped on the gas, my truck skidding as it lurched backward onto the road. Bailey whined beside me, his paws braced against the seat. My entire body shook as I forced the truck forward, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped away from the house, from the woods, from whatever had been waiting for me inside. The road stretched before me, dark and endless. My knuckles turned white around the wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. I needed to get to town. I needed people. I needed Carter. Bailey let out a small, sharp bark. I risked a glance at him, his body still turned toward the rear window. His ears twitched, his eyes locked onto something behind us. My stomach twisted. I turned my head just for a second, and I saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my brake lights. Still, watching. I hit the gas. The truck surged forward, leaving it behind, leaving everything behind. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sped through the empty streets, the town lights growing closer, safety finally within reach. I didn't stop until I reached the police station. When I stumbled inside, breathless and shaking, Carter was already there. His face was pale, his uniform streaked with dirt. His radio crackled at his hip, but he didn't move to answer it. He only stared at me as I stood there, my body trembling, my mouth opening and closing without words. "We found him," Carter said finally, his voice hollow. I blinked. "Who?" He swallowed hard. "Garrison." Relief shot through me so quickly I nearly collapsed. "Is he—" Carter hesitated. "He's alive, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Something in his face told me everything I needed to know. Bailey pressed against my leg, his body still rigid, still on edge. The radio crackled again. Carter exhaled, rubbing his face before turning to me. "Come inside, now." I hesitated, glancing toward the window. The road outside was quiet, but the feeling hadn't left. The weight, the presence. Somewhere, out there, the whistle was still waiting to be heard. And somehow, I knew this wasn't over.